So our next speaker is Dr. Denis Alexander, who was the founder, director of the Faraday Institute, along with Bob White. He's now the emeritus director. Before that, or simultaneously with that actually, he was chair of the molecular immunology program and head of the laboratory of lymphocyte signaling and development at the Babraham Institute in Cambridge. Before that, he's worked in a number of different places, including setting up National Unit of Human Genetics in Beirut. Denis has written and spoken extensively in science and religion. I was going to wave all his books, but I've got a pile that I just found on the Friday bookstall. His most recent one actually isn't on, I can't find a hard copy to wave at you, but it's Are We Slaves to Our Genes, published by Cambridge University Press, but I'm sure he'll tell you about that himself. And we're looking forward to hearing him speak to us on pastoral approaches to differing views on creation. Thank you, Denis.
Thank you, Ruth, very much. And I'll just start by saying hello, and I will start by sharing my screen and hope that the technology works okay. So we'll start in the usual kind of way, and I will try and, whoops, put it on full screen. Okay. Okay, I just look for a couple of thumbs up. Is that visible to everybody? Somebody can give me a thumbs up? Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Just to make sure we have technology working. It's always great when the technology works. Well, let me just start by saying what a privilege it is to be able to share a few thoughts with you this afternoon. I'm not going to talk all that long, but I will try and aim to leave a good 20 minutes or more for discussion and questions in a moment, but I hope I will give you enough to stimulate those questions as we think together about this particular topic, which is pastoral approaches to differing views on creation. And as you've just been hearing from Ruth, I'd like to just underline the fact I'm not a theologian, I'm not a philosopher. I'm just a regular scientist, biologist. I spent the last 40 years in the biological research community. So I'm coming to this topic very much from that kind of a background. But also in the past 20 years, I've just got more involved, I suppose, in thinking about some of these issues that we're going to think about in a couple of minutes, simply because of traveling and giving talks in many parts of the world on the science of faith and in the church context, as well as universities and other places. So this sort of comes out of really my own personal experience of the topic, but let me emphasize this is as a biologist, not a theologian. Okay, so this is the roadmap. I'd just like to highlight some of those key aspects of mainstream Christian theology that we all know, but I think I want to highlight those points which I think are particularly relevant to this particular topic. Then I want to just to think a little bit about how that sort of understanding relates to creationism and intelligent design. And then having done that, then I want to move on to much more of the pastoral issues that can arise, especially when these topics become sort of hot topics among certain members of our congregation, which can happen, as some of us have probably experienced. So as you'll know, the slides will be available for you a little later on maybe, and so there's no need to copy down quotations, anything like that, because they'll be around. Right, so you've already been hearing, I know, from Ruth this morning about the key factors of Christian theology, which are particularly in the theology of creation, particularly relevant to the science and faith discussion. And as Ruth was telling us this morning, the picture that emerges from the biblical understanding of creation and reflection of many, many centuries by many theologians is of a God who is the ultimate source of all that exists, that ultimate cause, if you like, that all that exists, everything that exists apart from God only came into existence and continues to exist because God wills it so. So in this view then, existence basically means anything that is not God, anything that exists outside of the Godhead, if you like, be that existence, material things, immaterial, it doesn't really matter. Might be the laws of nature, might be Higgs bosons, it might be quantum vacuums, it might be trees, rabbits, you, me, elements of the periodic table, gravity. It doesn't matter if it exists. If it exists outside of the Godhead, then that is part of the created order in this framework. And of course, immediately that faces us with a little bit of a challenge, doesn't it? Because as we use the word creation in our own daily language in various kinds of ways, then immediately we notice how very different is the understanding of God as creator. Because when we human beings make things, we're working together with already existing materials to produce something new. And so the human act of creating is not the complete cause of what is produced, but God's creative act is the creative complete cause of what is produced. And I like this quote from Bill Carroll. I think it's worth just meditating on it in full for a moment. God's causality is so different, writes Bill Carroll, Oxford theologian, from the causality of creatures, that there is no competition between the two. That is, we do not need to limit, as it were, God's causality to make room for the causality of creatures. God causes creatures to be causes. Creation is not essentially some distant event. Rather, it is the ongoing complete causing of the existence of all that is. At this very moment, were God not causing all that is to exist, there would be nothing at all. Creation concerns, first of all, the origin of the universe, not its temporal beginning. Close quote. So creation then is about, it's about ontology, it's about the existence of things, about the meanings of their existence. And speaking of God as creator within this traditional Christian framework does not entail the suggestion of some sort of alternative mechanism as to how God creates things compared to that provided by science, for the simple reason that's really not what creation is about in terms of its theological context. It's actually about how and why anything exists, that is, in a way that renders the scientific enterprise possible. And since God is not encompassed or constrained in any way by the present created order in which we find ourselves, which we refer to as his transcendence, that means that we as human creatures are in no position at all to dictate, guess, or whatever word you want to use there, how God might wish to do his creation. We're not in a position to, as it were, speaking crudely, tell God how he should do it. And that idea has, of course, these deep theological roots, as God speaks to the prophet Isaiah, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And then some meditating on God as creator. Our God is in heaven, he does whatever pleases him. It's interesting, I think, that historians of science have often pointed to this idea of the transcendence of God and the consequent radical contingency, we call it, of the created order upon God's will, upon his say-so. They pointed to this as one of the great motivations historically for empiricism, for the historical method, for the experimental method, sorry, I meant to say. For you cannot simply guess how the created order might work simply starting from common sense or from simple human logic. Let's just say we've been visiting this planet 4 billion years ago when it was a desolate, inchoate mass of disorganized materials undergoing frequent asteroid bombardment. I mean, no one could have predicted, could they, at that moment, had anybody been alive, that after a 3 billion year history, then it would become the home of saints and sinners. And so along with that amazing transcendence or otherness of God in the biblical literature comes, of course, this great emphasis on the immanence of God in the created order, that God who is involved in the moment by moment sustaining, upholding of everything that exists. I love this. Genesis 1:3 verse, God's ruach, his spirit swept over the surface of the water. And then the theologian Jürgen Moltmann, meditating on that verse. The divine spirit, ruach, is the creative power and the presence of God in his creation. The whole creation is a fabric woven by the spirit and is therefore a reality to which the spirit gives form. And the New Testament, of course, reminds us that we live in a Christological creation. Through the Logos, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. And so there is nothing that exists that has not been brought into existence, apart from the Logos in all that wonderful intelligence and intelligibility. And then, of course, Paul in Colossians 1, one of the most remarkable passages, I think, certainly about creation in the whole of the Bible. For by the Son of God, says Paul, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. All things exist, consist, hold together. I was somehow think about this as that heavenly glue, if you like, that just holds everything together and makes the universe what it is and enables us indeed to have a science which is both possible and intelligible. And I'm sure you've heard many others efforts, those metaphors, those figurative methods of speech, which enable us to think about what it really means for God to be immanent in the created order. Maybe God is composer and conductor of the symphony of creation, a great picture of all the musical instruments playing their part and God weaving them together into really this wonderful music of creation that we look at and we enjoy today. Here is Charles Raven, who was previously master of Christ College, Cambridge. You might remember this as Darwin's old college, and Charles Raven was one of the main voices, thinkers in the science faith arena in the early part of the 20th century. And he put it like this: God, his father, was like an artist deciding to create a picture. God, the Son, was the design on which the work was modeled, and the Holy Spirit was the creative energy in the artist that created the picture. Another wonderful quotation there, I think, Christological, the Trinitarian doctrine of creation. That's so important, I think, in this whole discussion. And of course, all this helps us to understand why the God of the Apps idea of God is so unsatisfactory. I'm sure you're familiar with this idea. There we've got scientific knowledge represented by this kind of yellow Swiss cheese, if you like, on the left-hand side of your screen. And those white circles are those gaps in our present scientific knowledge. And I'm sure we all know people, not only believers, but atheists do the same, actually. They wish to somehow place their particular understanding of God or belief in God in those present gaps in our scientific knowledge. And of course, we know what happens, the gaps fill up, and gradually that concept of God as the God of the gaps begins to vaporize and to be pushed out. And of course, we go back to this wonderful quotation from Augustine of Hippo in his book, the literal commentary on Genesis, 115 AD. I guess it was, nature is what God does, nature is what God has done, or nature is what God does. I just think that's a good reminder of what we do as scientists to investigate what God does in the created order. So certainly Christians have no hidden investments in scientific ignorance. We're not looking for, we're trying to close the gaps as Christians to give greater worship to God as creator. And also this acts as a reminder of what we biologists actually are doing in our science, really, doesn't it? So, or any scientist, I suppose, we think of God as the primary cause, using the language of Aquinas, 13th century, and then everything that exists as due to those secondary causes that God uses to bring about his the processes, the mechanisms of the universe, whereby God brings out his created order. And then we scientists are simply seeking to examine, to investigate, to understand better those secondary causes. And I think that's a good reminder of what we're doing as we think of the theology of creation. One point, I suppose, on this, which often arises, is the worry that does that then somehow entail a deterministic universe in which God is the divine puppet master, somehow micromanaging every event. And I think the answer from traditional creation theology is definitely no, that's no necessary consequence of the kind of theology that we've been outlining so far. For by faithfully guaranteeing order and gnomic regularity in the properties of matter, by his immanence in the created order, by that same token, God is bestowing upon the created order its own functional integrity. We find some hint of that idea, I think, don't we, in Genesis chapter 1, where God uses this language of gracious allowance in saying, let the land produce vegetation. So matter does what matter does. And if it didn't do that, then we wouldn't know where we were, because then life would lose all its coherence. We would have no necessary order, no reproducibility, and there wouldn't be any life around anyway, would there? So I think that's just worth highlighting that point. So clearly what we have here really are these two complementary ways of understanding the reality of the created order around us. We have that creation story provided by theology, answering more the questions of why God did it, why does God bring about this amazing history on planet Earth, and then the evolutionary story provided by biology, this second narrative, if you like, of how God did it, what are the mechanisms and so on, all those things that we as biologists are interested in. And I guess it's worth pointing out also that at this point, that studying the evolutionary process does actually bring some non-religious people to at least start thinking about the existence of God, about the meaning of the universe, and some of these great big questions. A great example of natural theology in action. And simply because evolutionary history is so remarkable, isn't it? So finely tuned. The fact there we all are, we're all living things joined up by remarkable history in this great Darwin's tree of life. We're all made of the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, which are the very stuff of stardust. And yet here we are through this long evolutionary process, coming to the point where we can actually take an interest in our own history, where we can share those thoughts, we can publish them, we can have Zoom calls with each other, and we have a humanity that can meditate upon the meaning of our own existence. That is a very remarkable history, and I think is a profound and deep challenge to atheistic understandings of the world. But let us move on. And let us move on to think now a little bit about creationism. Again, I'm sure a topic that we're familiar with, but just so we're all on the same page here. As you know, there are two brands, if you like, of creationism. There's young earth creationism. The earth is only around 10,000 years old. And then there's the old earth creationism, which believes in the current scientific understanding of the age of the earth that's around 4.5 billion years old. Having said that, there are a number of things that unite these two different kinds of creationism listed here. First of all, I think both would share a fairly literalistic hermeneutics that aims to derive scientific information from the Bible, especially from those early chapters of Genesis. Secondly, both share the idea of special creation. That is to say, there are key living species that then evolve to provide the diversity that we see today. And certainly, I think both types of creationists would see the first humans, Adam and Eve, as being especially created by God. Thirdly, I would say that the theology of creation that is shared by these two kinds of creationism is actually quite distinct from what I would call the mainstream theology of creation that we've just been thinking about. And so, of course, in our traditional creation theology, we have God as creating everything ex nihilo, just once, that is it. But in these various brands of creationism, we have actually God creating ex nihilo, or in various other kinds of similar ways, let's put it that way, because there's a variation of views on this, but as God creating ex nihilo, not once, but many times. And then, of course, there is a shared disbelief in all forms of creationism in the standard Darwinian of evolution. And that can lead to some forms of creationists self-describing themselves as scientific creationists, because they wish to derive science, if you like, partly from the Bible, but also then they draw in many arguments from contemporary science to try and give this biblical science, as it were, some extra validation and support. And I guess one of the main motivations for holding to both types of creationism is the conviction that those who hold to a different kind of view are not really interpreting scripture correctly. And if you don't interpret Genesis 1 to 3 in this particular kind of way, then you're going to give up on the fall, you're going to give up on really the whole of salvation history will collapse. The substitutionary atonement of Christ will no longer have the same meaning, and so on and so on. I'm often accused as an evolutionary biologist of disappearing off down that rabbit hole. That I'm somehow definitely not a proper Christian because I don't really agree with that particular kind of interpretation of Genesis 1 to 3 and so forth. So sometimes I'm sadly to say seen as a kind of opponent of real Christian faith. There's actually a lot of recent interesting data on how many creationists are there actually, young earth creationists are there in the United Kingdom. We had a sociologist called Amy Unsworth who worked with us in the Faraday Institute for quite a number of years on this particular question and related questions. And I haven't got time really to present all the data. This is Amy Unsworth's data. She's now moved on to another position at the University College in London as a lecturer there in sociology. But she's got this rather interesting set of data from a YouGov poll. I'm just clicking here to fill all the answers in. But all I want to draw your attention to at the moment is on the right-hand side, you'll see some red writing there and a 2%. And what that refers to is that in 5 of the questions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions on the left, then if people sort of ticked all those, if they strongly agree or disagree with those questions, then this sort of lines them up as young earth creationists. And that comes to around 2% of the UK population, according to this very large YouGov poll that Amy was sponsoring with a nice grant from somewhere just a few years ago as part of the Faraday Institute. That's important just to mention that, because if you simply ask the question to the UK population, do you believe in the Earth only being 10,000 years old? You get a lot of non-religious people will say, yes, that's what I think. So we come to the issue of the public understanding of science, communication of science, that sort of thing. It needs careful attention. And I'm afraid some of the BBC polls and so on really they're not careful enough about the way they do their sociology. And if you want me to send, if anyone's interested in this paper, by the way, with all these results from Amy Unsworth, I'd be very glad to send it to you later. But let's move on. So that was just a little bit about creationism, a little bit then about intelligent design, because I know some people find this a little bit, the language here, not entirely clear. And what we need to do, I think, here is make a clear distinction between intelligent design with a small I and a small d, which I would just say is basically what all Christians believe, that God is this creator who has designed the universe in such an intelligible way that it fulfills his purposes. So I think all Christians believe that in some kind of a way. So intelligent design we're speaking of here has a big I and a big D. This is an anti-Darwinian movement which was pioneered by a US lawyer called Philip Johnson back in the early 1990s. And it's seeking to identify highly specialized examples of design in living organisms and put these examples forward as evidence for a designer, because they cannot, it is claimed, be explained by traditional kind of Darwinian types of processes. And I suppose it's worth pointing out that ID is certainly not the same as creationism, although you find in the press, the media very often, it'll mix them up and call, ID folk creationists. I don't think that is correct. For many ID proponents, not all, I would say it's quite fair to call it a first cousin of creationism, particularly in its strong opposition to Darwinian evolution. Maybe more technically, ID in Christian hands is a form of episodic creationism. But it's worth pointing out that there are also atheist ID proponents or agnostic ID proponents. I've debated with some of them actually in Texas some years ago, I remember. So it's a very broad spectrum. And so all I just briefly want to do here is kind of try and highlight that and then tell you what I think are the sort of commonalities that you get within that movement. So one of the founders actually of the ID movement is Bill Dembski, who formally kind of left the movement a couple of years ago. And so his writings are particularly influential, I think, still in that particular movement. He maintains, and I quote, that whereas organisms have undergone some change in the course of natural history, this change has occurred within strict limits, and human beings were specially created, although elsewhere he states that intelligent design is perfectly compatible with common descent. So there's sort of mingling there of traditional creationist beliefs with a move in some ways towards more evolutionary beliefs to some degree. When you come to Michael Behe, who is again one of the early founders of the movement, a Catholic thinker in this area, he says, as I quote here, it's hard to imagine how there could be stronger evidence for common ancestry of chimps and humans. So he clearly accepts, this common ancestry, but at the same time believes that there are certain things that are so impossible to explain, by traditional scientific means that these are kind of designed and therefore evidence for a designer. Okay, so what we have then in the ID movement is that you have a sort of big arrow going from what they call irreducibly complex items in biology, and then an inference to design, and then from there an inference to a designer. So I think what we have here is a sort of what I would call a strong form of natural theology, at least certainly in the hands of Christian ID proponents. I think that's what I would want to call it. And what the ID folk have in common are the following. First of all, the claim that science in general and evolution in particular are infused with the philosophy of naturalism. I'll come back to that point in just a moment. Secondly, that there are biological entities such as the bacterial flagellum that are irreducibly complex, meaning that they are only functional if all the components are present. Therefore, such entities, it is claimed, could not have evolved. Thirdly, such irreducibly complex entities are explained by a design inference. And so such entities in nature can be identified as displaying design. And fourthly, ID proponents claim that their ideas are strictly scientific, not religious, and should therefore be taught in a science classroom as an alternative view to evolution. And I think, of course, that explains why, not so much recently, but in past years, there have been these court cases in the United States about what exactly you allow to be taught in US schools and so forth. I just want to flag up 3 problems, I think, with the intelligent design way of looking at things. Partly, I think, because as we look at that, it helps us to perhaps unpackage a little bit where they're coming from. And really, what I want to do here is not be a big critique or something, although I am a bit of a critique, to be honest, but basically, I want us just to understand where they're coming from, because that might help us in some of these ideas come in members of our congregation and so forth. And maybe we ourselves have some of those ideas as well, so we can obviously have a discussion about it. But I think the problems I see, a number of them. First of all, it's really, ID I don't think is really part of science, because science is about testable ideas. The purpose of scientific theories in biology is to explain the relationships between all those components of the created order which comprise living matter. That's what we're trying to do. And we have this important criterion in science and in biology is, that something is testable. That is to say, you can see how it lines up with certain kinds of data. But if you simply claim that something is designed, it's very hard to know really, how would you go about testing that? That is more of a philosophical or theological idea. It's not really a scientific idea. So a successful theory in science is always going to be one which leads to a research program which will aim to establish its truth status or not. So I guess this really explains why we see quite a lack of publications coming out of in the scientific, in regular scientific literature coming out of the ID movement. Second problem, all living systems, I think without exception, are irreducibly complex, and they consist of many components that all need to function together. And so I think simply a fact about what we understand life to be. And so I think what we tend to have an idea is a kind of fallacy of large numbers. As soon as you have a multi-component system, then the chances of it coming into being all at once, of course, zero. But nobody in science, nobody in biology, and the origin life research, I mean, nobody thinks that's how living things, of course, come into being and so forth. No, we don't think they'll suddenly pop into being all at once, but through a very long process. Evolution works incrementally. And of course, I think it's for that reason that sometimes it's claimed that the ID folk are really propounding a sort of designer of the gaps. We really talk about God of the gaps, but here we have a gap in our current scientific understanding, and then we're going to put a designer and infer the existence of a designed God from that argument. And I just want to point out, I think that's a bit of a dangerous argument, really, and can lead down all kinds of unhelpful pathways. The other problem I just want to highlight, I think, with some of the ID literature is this whole question of what we understand by naturalism. And if you go to the Oxford Dictionary, of course, we find that naturalism is a view of the world that excludes supernatural or spiritual. Now, if you go to Philip Johnson, I would say that the real original founder of the ID movement, he says it is conceivable that God, for some reason, did all the creating by apparently naturalistic processes, and theistic evolution can more accurately be described as theistic naturalism. I just don't think that really means, to me, it's not a coherent idea, basically, because theistic naturalism is an oxymoron. You can't really put those two concepts together. Either you believe in a God who creates, and he creates everything, and so there simply are no naturalistic processes because naturalism is false, or you don't believe in a God, and then you are a real naturalist then in that case. So I think then there's a bit of a tangle there in the language game, we can call it, in some of the ID literature. Because if you end up with a sort of, some of the understandings I read anyway in the ID literature, you kind of get a sort of two-tier universe. Here you have the natural forces doing certain things over here, and then you've got the design bits. I put those in little sort of red circles there. Or if you take human anatomy, you've got the sort of design bits, which we can't really fully understand yet how evolution works to get there. And then we've got the evolved bits where we all accept, yeah, that's how evolution works. So you end up with sort of two-tier universe, and theologically, I think this is deeply problematic. So there's some of the problems. Right, now I want to spend the last time, sorry, it's taking a little bit time to get here, but just thinking about the pastoral issues and what kind of problems can arise when we start thinking about these in our congregations. You may never have had these. We may have them every day. I don't know. It depends on the church. But firstly, a very common pastoral issue, more in the States, I think, in the United States and over here in the UK, but maybe a young person's taught by their family, by the church, that young earth creationism is the only acceptable approach to understanding creation. And then this person goes off to university. They find that such a position is unsustainable. And then they get this terrible dilemma of choosing between science and faith. They have this cognitive dissonance. And very often what happens, sadly, is they choose science and they throw away their faith because they can't see how these two things can possibly go together. And I know some very sad stories about that scenario. I just mentioned there one very sad story, a tragic story a few years ago that I heard from a good friend in South Africa, where, again, a young person brought up in a very fundamentalist home in South Africa, Christian home, went off to University of Cape Town to study biology, went through exactly the process I've just been describing, and ended up committing suicide because they just couldn't find out how to relate these things together. Very, very sad kind of outcome, I'm afraid. Another problem, the unity issue. Sometimes you get church members who are campaigners. They aim to convert other members of the congregation to their particular perspective. And this can lead to confrontational situations. It can lead to oppositional campaigning. It can lead to distraction from the really important aspects of the Christian faith. I think it can lead to disunity. I think the most difficult situation can arise that I have myself experienced is adopted by this idea you can't be a real Christian if you believe in evolution. And of course, that is a really sad type of situation to arise. And then thirdly, we have, I think, the issue of integrity. especially maybe those studying biology at school, and they start separating their faith from their science without the sort of feeling they need to be separated somehow in order to preserve them. And those, of course, all truth is God's truth. And as a biologist, I have to say that the evidence for evolution is simply overwhelming. And indeed, it is the paradigm within which all biological and science research is carried out, not least the current research on the evolution of viruses. Won't go there. And so I think as church leaders, we should really be helping young people and older people to integrate their faith with mainstream science, not to act as if they live somehow in these two kind of waterproof compartments. Fourthly, I think there is a reputational issue involved in all this, and that can in turn generate pastoral challenges. For if the general public get the impression that Christians are creationists, then it's easy for them to then think that all Christians are anti-science, or they're just sort of some kind of nutter or flat earther or something like that. In fact, incredible as it may seem, Professor of Education Barry Billingsley has some data I know that shows that most younger school pupils in this country believe that all the bishops of the Church of England are creationists. And we may kind of laugh at that sometimes. It's not really funny though. I think it's just a distressing lack of communication of public understandable science and faith kind of issues in this country. And I think I've just got time to tell you one story. I apologize here to the Anglicans listening today, but there is a sort of lesson from history, from our recent history here, from as recently as 2009. You remember perhaps that this was the double anniversary of Charles Darwin, 1809, his birth date, 1859, the date when he published his great book, The Origin of Species. And at that time in 2009, a spokesperson for the Anglican Church, whose name I cannot remember, it's probably a good thing I can't remember actually, came out and said, we want to give, on behalf of the Anglican Church, we want to apologize for the way the Anglican Church treated Darwin back in the 19th century. And I kind of blinked when I heard that and I thought, what is that about? Because if you think about the history of Darwin, I mean, he wouldn't have known his science, but for the Anglican Church teaching he received here in Cambridge. I mean, by the mid 1860s, there were questions appearing in the natural science papers here in Cambridge, which clearly demonstrated that all those setting these questions were fully convinced of the theory of Mr. Darwin, of the truth of Mr. Darwin's theory. And of course, as you remember, all teaching in Cambridge, as well as in Oxford at that time, were carried out by ordained ministers of the Anglican Church and so on. Anyway, I just flagged that up, that I think it's important that we understand and have a bit of a grasp of the history of the reception of Darwinism for some of these discussions. I think that's important. So how do we address these issues? Just a few minutes on that and we'll stop them for some discussion. My minimalist approach, it's not a very ambitious one, but I think it's simply to accept that everyone in our congregations can be a perfectly faithful Christian and yet have a different view on this particular issue. This is not a gospel issue. Christians are not going to be judged exactly, when they reach the pearly gates about what we're going to believe exactly on Genesis 1-3. And so I think it's important. Actually, my own church here in Cambridge, I would say, has somewhat of a range of views on these kind of issues. And I think the key thing is that we aim to live together in unity as believers worshiping the same God, and we're willing to accept one another even if we have a little bit of different views on this issue. Second, if the teaching in the church is clear on hermeneutical principles, I don't think the type of young earth creationism is unlikely. I think it's unlikely to become an issue, isn't it? Because if people really begin to understand from long-term teaching in the churches that there are more than 20 kinds of literature in the church, the fact that Genesis 1-3 contains much figurative language and so forth and so on, especially that the early church fathers treated the Genesis text as theological text. All of that, I think, if that comes across in our teaching, then I think it's very unlikely that we're really going to see a problem emerging from, let's say, young earth creationism. I always have some quotes up my sleeve, I must say, in thinking about this. I love this one. This is from Philo, highly influential Alexandrian Jew, first century, contemporary of both Jesus and Paul, who explained at some length how the days of creation, the image of God, Adam and Eve, and the Garden of Eden were all intended symbolically rather than literally, being no mythical fictions, but models, modes of making ideas visible. And then, of course, we've already quoted from St. Augustine on the literal meaning of Genesis. And I like his commentary, which you can still get hold of, because whatever it is, it's not literalistic. Here we are in his exposition of Genesis chapter 1. Some works belong to the invisible days in which he created all things simultaneously, and others belong to the days in which he daily fashions whatever evolves in the course of time from what I call the primordial wrappers. A lovely phrase. Again, jumping forward 1500 years, Calvin, his commentary on Genesis, nothing is here treated of but the visible form of the world. He who would learn astronomy and other recondite arts, complicated arts, let him go elsewhere. Well, we have many, many other quotes, and I hope we can use these in our sermons and our teaching, because I think it's a great help in getting across some of these kinds of points we want to flag up here. And thirdly, I think it's really important, isn't it, to convey a positive message about science from the pulpit. I think we've already been thinking about that a lot here earlier on today, so I'll just skip that point to make sure we leave plenty of time for discussion. Also, I think it is important to realize this very quick response of theologians of the 19th century, especially Anglican theologians, in their reception of Darwinian evolution. And I like these two quotes from two historians, Professor James Moore, Open University here in the UK, with but few exceptions, the leading Christian thinkers in Great Britain came to terms quite readily with Darwinism and evolution. And then the parallel quote relating now to the reception of Darwinism in the United States from George Marsden, very well-respected American historian. With the exception of Harvard's Louis Agassiz, virtually every American Protestant zoologist and botanist accepted some form of evolution by the early 1870s. I think it's important that we get that message across, because it's often lost. Simply, people don't realize that Earth creationism only really got going in the early 1960s. It's a very recent movement, so the history of that is fascinating. Then fifthly and lastly, I think the importance of a balanced repertoire of teaching on God as creator. The fact, of course, that we are all creationists in the sense of believing in God as creator. Importance of giving our congregations the whole sweep of the doctrine of creation from Old and New Testaments. It's not just located in Genesis 1 to 3, which is so often where this discussion can land up in and get stuck. Nature is what God does. God is that creator of the whole created order, and so forth. And then the importance of providing a doctrinal framework which highlights both the transcendence and immanence of God in the created order, I think, is really very key to this whole discussion. So we are left then with this challenge, of David, our youth leader, let's say, going off to university to study biology soon. He's been around as a Christian as a teenager in our church for many years, but now, how is he going to cope and engage with the biological sciences that he's going to be studying for the next 3 years? Hopefully, we've given him a solid grounding in how to interpret the scriptures. Hopefully, we've helped him to start in this process of integrating his science with his faith. Has he, a very practical point, has he read at least one book which provides him with a positive message concerning the relationship between biology and faith? So on that very practical note, let me finish and just flag up a few books. I'm afraid a couple of them shamelessly are my own books on this particular topic. Creation and evolution, do we have to choose? Is there purpose in biology? You can get those from the online shop at Faraday more cheaply than you can get them from Amazon. If you do happen to go on the online shop, by the way, and it tells you you'll have to wait a long time, it won't be very long. Things will be, you'll get copies quite soon. I'm not sure we've got The Language of God there by Francis Collins, a wonderful Christian leading scientist in the United States. You can certainly get it from Amazon for £6.89. So, and with that thought, thank you very much for listening. Sorry I've gone on 4 minutes over time, but there we go. Still plenty of time for questions and discussion. Thank you.